There you go. Okay, you're good to go.
Okay. And let me just hit one more button here for everyone. There we are. Thank you so much for joining us. Had a little technical things. I have to get myself all together. Welcome to the Novi Public Library's Talking Racism second event. We had a great conversation last week, and now I'm so excited about the conversation we're going to have today because we have some great guests today. Joining me this evening is Mr. Reginald Turner, and he grew up in Detroit, Michigan. He earned his bachelor's degree in psychology from Wayne State University and his law degree from the University of Michigan Law School. In 2000, he joined Clark Hill PLC, and today is a member of its executive committee. In 2002, he served as president of the State Bar of Michigan. He is on the board of Comerica Bank and Masco Corporation. Since 2017, he's been vice chair of the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. And very good news here, he's been just named the president-elect of the American Bar Association. Welcome and congratulations to you, Mr. Turner.
Thank you very much, Gail. It's a privilege to be here with you.
So glad. And then the next person, all I can say is phenomenal. I think I always call her that. I've always called her that ever since I've known her. She's actually Judge Cynthia Diane Stevens, who's a judge of the Michigan Court of Appeals, First District. Ms. Stevens was appointed to the court in 2008. She was previously a circuit court judge and a district court judge. She has been a law professor at Wayne State University and the University of Detroit Mercy. She has her law degree from Emory University School of Law. Welcome, Judge Stevens. So glad to have you here.
Absolutely wonderful to be here.
Thank you very much. Looking for a great conversation this evening, and we're going to jump right into it and talk about what our topic is, racism. Some people don't consider themselves racist one way or the other. Some know that they're racist, and some maybe just haven't given it a thought and just assume that they're not. Let's start with you, Judge Stevens. What defines racism and anti-racism?
Sure. Racism is, certainly there's personal prejudice, right? There is personal rudeness, but racism is an exercise of power where individuals, based upon immutable characteristics, are able to exercise power to the detriment of others. Meaning, a system, a group, or a human is able to say to another human being, I deprive you of a portion of your humanity because I have the ability to give you that or take it away. And it's different. It's very, very different from prejudice, because prejudice says, I feel a certain way, and I feel lots of ways. But if I feel it, and all I can do is just be mean to you, like the mean girl syndrome we all went through when we were 13, that's not pleasant, but it won't affect my life. I'm not likely to lose my life. I'm not likely to, based upon that, lose my ability to make a living. I'm not likely to lose my children. But when an individual or a group is in a power position and they can exercise the power to deprive an individual of their rights, privileges, and full humanity, that's different. But mainly what I've been dealing with my colleagues and acquaintances is, so is it like I'm a racist or I'm not? And I remember Angela Davis some time ago saying it's not enough to not be a racist, be actively engaged in the deprivation of the rights of others. But any individual who, simply by virtue of being alive and their characteristics, is a recipient of the benefits of the racism of others, right? Angela said their responsibility was to be anti-racist. In medicine, if there's an itis, there needs to be an opposite. So anti-racist is the opposite of racism. And it means an individual who says, okay, so I know I am not my grandmother, I am not my grandfather, I am not my uncle, I'm not my nephew. But by virtue of not being Black, I know that I'm the beneficiary of, let's just say, the first GI Bill, which allowed other people's uncles and aunts to buy houses, but didn't let my dad, when he came back from Korea, do the same. Okay, I'm the nephew of somebody who did that. I didn't do it, but what's my job? My job is to be anti-racist. So when I hear, quote, casual comments, when I perceive exclusion, I have to actually dig deep down in my belly and say something or do something. So racism is the exercise of power. Anti-racism is the exercise of voice and power to combat the legacy of racism. That would be my view. I don't know what you think, Reggie. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you, Your Honor. I certainly understand that, that racism is an exercise of power in many instances. And it is consistent with what we all learned about in our high school and college reading assignments about man's inhumanity to man. It is something that happens among humans, and it has happened from the beginning of time, and will continue to happen. We are not always good to each other. Racism is just one of the ways that we divide ourselves, and it is, again, an assertion of power over people who have less power in order to gain rights over those individuals, or to deprive those individuals of rights. Our nation was founded with slaves being treated as 3/5 of a person for counting purposes. Our nation had a civil war in which the transatlantic slave trade and the plantations of the South were defending their right to own people of color as chattel. And over the course of our history, we have seen again and again attempts to dehumanize people of color, to deprive people of color of opportunities that would otherwise be open. And that's not going to go away, unfortunately. What is really important, however, is that there can be factors and actions that help to reduce the negative impact of racism and to root it out wherever we see it. And there are many organizations and people who are deeply involved in work to do that. It is work that will never be ended because the problem will never end. Again, I don't think we'll ever get to a point where there is no animus toward people who are different. And it is not, I know our title of our program today is that racism is a white person's problem. I think that that there can be racial animus among various racial groups, but I think, as we mentioned before, the power to have significant impact on the rights of groups, at least in the US and in Europe and other parts of the world, typically is in the hands of white people. And that, of course, means that racism is most often creating victims who are people of color. Again, I don't think that's something that will change in my lifetime, but I think I will never stop working to reduce it in my lifetime. And that is it's an eternal battle. And it's our obligation. And I think that no matter what race you are, whether your ancestors are from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, we all have a responsibility to work to reduce the impact of racism on our society. If for no other reason than that it deprives us of the talent, skills, and abilities of people who would otherwise make great contributions.
And Reggie, I appreciate the idea that America loses by virtue of failing to fully avail itself of the talents and opportunities of Black people and brown people. And I got that. My concern is that a country that does not moderate its systemic racism in the face of its browning is subject to long-term demise. It either becomes South Africa, where you legitimize the minority being in charge of the majority, or you have just a tremendous crises and fractioning that it's cataclysmic. Isabella Wilkerson, 2 weeks ago, did an amazing piece in the New York Times in which she started to look at the concept of caste and race and how they have been synonyms for one another, at least in the United States, where they have become those words, those concepts. Martin Luther King, when he went to India, was greeted by being told, by being described as an untouchable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it completely freaked him out. He was like, what? I'm here. I got my PhD. I am a world leader. I have been doing this and that and the other. And you actually just called me an untouchable. But after he paused, he said, I probably am. Because in the perception of much of society, I am relegated, regardless of my credentials and whatever, as a person who is presumed to be less than. I am presumed to be in the hierarchy of human value less than whatever the default is. And the default continues to be persons who perceive themselves as white and what whiteness is, which changes, by the way, over time and space. I was reading recently about how the first wave of persons who came from the Middle East to the US, who came principally from Lebanon and some from Syria, and how they got classified as white. And it was a convenience to afford them immigration status. And I was like, okay, that works. I know how bureaucratically that can happen, but I'm like, they're from North Africa. What? Really? Over time, whiteness has been ascribed to the default culture, be the default norm for a world that simply isn't that way. So I appreciate that we're always going to be struggling against it because, as we're always told, we're always struggling between good and evil, right? That's always there. But I think that the responsibility for each of us to struggle against it is different. It is different for those who are the beneficiaries of what is in fact white privilege than it is for those of us who are either African Americans or Asians or other, who are described as others and who are outside the default class. And this is a moment when, for the very first time in a long time, we're looking at what's the responsibility of the beneficiaries of privilege. And is that responsibility purely moral? Is there a, as some people say, business case for it? Is it a national defense issue? What is it? I happen to think it's all of those. And I think that the responsibility of those who are the heirs of centuries of white privilege is different than mine.
Mr. Turner, you hit on it in conjunction with our topic, Black not being a Black issue. How do we get non-Black people to embrace the fact that racism is not a Black issue beyond just saying things have to change?
Well, there have been so many studies that have demonstrated over the course of the last 50 years or so from esteemed scholars that have determined that racial diversity is an asset in the corporate world, in education, in literally every endeavor of humans. Having diverse backgrounds for the people who are participating in an activity tends to produce better outcomes from activities. And that is something that corporate America has embraced fairly well over the course of the last 30 to 40 years. I had the privilege of serving on a team of lawyers in the Gratz and Grutter cases that went all the way to the US Supreme Court, dealing with diversity in college admissions. And the Supreme Court rulings in both the Gratz and Grutter cases recognized the importance of diversity in education and in creating a diverse workforce to get better outcomes for our nation. And those themes were enshrined in the opinions of the US Supreme Court in both those cases. It's not just my view. There were mountains of evidence produced in those cases with respect to the benefits of diversity and inclusion. We should all be looking for ways to fulfill America's potentially positive destiny by fighting for diversity and inclusion as much as we possibly can, and to be anti-racist.
And I see a lot of diversity and inclusion programs on our jobs, and it's been going on. We've had these programs, mandatory programs, for years now. Is it effective, Judge Stevens?
Well, it depends. Words matter. So I can recall conversations about, quote, tolerance, right? Tolerance presumes that I am in a position to have to give you permission to be. Then we said tolerance has luckily gone away. because I can tolerate a fly on the back porch as long as they're not 10 of them. So we got rid of tolerance. Okay. Then the conversation changed to diversity. And diversity says that there's a dominant group, and then there's some other persons. And if those other persons who are not part of the dominant group are there, we're diverse. Okay. But we could
go on, please.
But diverse without actual inclusion doesn't work out too well, because we can all be diverse in our silos. So how programs have worked and what their effect is depends in part on their intent and in part on institutional and individual commitment, and in part on consistent measuring. In the Bible, it says, where your heart is, so is your treasure, you know? Mm-hmm. If we don't count it, we probably don't know about it. If we don't consistently evaluate it, it's, you know, we're humans. Most of us have friendships or intimate relationships where periodically we say to the other person, I don't like this. And then the other person goes, yeah, I'm gonna fix it. But then after about 6 weeks or 6 hours or 6 minutes, we go back to doing what we used to do because nobody's checking in on it. Mm-hmm. So if you don't check in on it, it's not gonna change.
But Reggie, I wanted to throw in too, because that was going to mention with my next question, and Mr. Turner, you can address both. It seems like to me that everything is dying down just a little bit, maybe, or even a lot, with the whole racism uprising that we had last week and the week before. Now we've moved on to wearing masks and our children going back to school. What needs to be done to keep the momentum going and accountability? And what's the next step other than just, whew, that's over, next? You know, what do we do?
Well, as I said at the beginning, man's inhumanity to man will not cease. There will always be a need for people of goodwill to be vigilant with respect to protecting the rights of not just people of racial differences, but also of the poor, the needy. You know, in my profession as a lawyer, I pledge in my oath that I shall never reject from any consideration personal to myself the cause of the defenseless or oppressed, or delay anyone's cause for lucre or malice. It has been my privilege over the course of time to work in many different organizations, starting after the 1967 riot, when my parents enrolled our family in the Focus Hope program with city and suburban families paired together to create better understanding among these, and in those days called Negro families. We were paired with the Latanzio family from St. Clair Shores, Michigan, and working with them on and playing with them over the course of several years opened our eyes as the Turner family, and their eyes were opened as well. But it started because our hearts were open. Our parents put us in that position so that we could learn about how to get along with people who were of different racial backgrounds. More of that needs to go on today, but even without programs like the one that benefited my family, there is a moral obligation for all of us to work to ensure that people have equality of opportunity. It is enshrined in our Constitution. It is the right thing to do from a business standpoint. And for some of us, it's a spiritual calling. all of the world's great religions make it clear that we should treat others with respect, that we should care for the poor and the needy. And in the New Testament, Jesus says, that which you have done for the least of these, my brethren, you've done for me. In the Torah, there are like provisions. There is, I believe that there are many reasons that we must all be vigilant in living out the possibility of a world in which discrimination does not deprive people of their rights or deprive our nation, our great nation, and our world of the talents that can be exercised by those who would otherwise be relegated to menial tasks.
Maybe, Reggie, sometimes we need to tell more stories, right? Because it is very easy to look at, for example, the most recent victims of homicide, and for a plurality of the world to say, well, those people were very different. They were in a precarious circumstance based upon certain activity. They were persons who had committed some infraction, a number of things that allow people to distance themselves from whether it is George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or baby Tamir Rice or whoever, because people can't see themselves. And so maybe, while I do believe that this is principally work that those descended from Europe need to be doing within their group, sometimes the stories of, and you introduced Reggie, that introduction, it was cute, but it wasn't it. You know how they talk about the EGOT? They talk about the EGOT for actors, right? Okay. So Rob been the president of the local Black Bar Association. He said, okay, that was good. He was the president of the state bar, right? He was the president of the National African American Bar. And now he will become the president of the largest organization of American lawyers ever. Okay. So if there's like a chronic overachiever, it would be Mr. Turner's baby boy, and his dad was a police officer. Okay. I promise you that Latanzio family, Wayne State, Cops kid, University of Michigan lawyer, he walks down the street and 2 out of 3 times, no matter how fine that suit he has on is, he is basically N number 5. And so I think that understanding his experiences might enlighten people to realize it does not matter. This is not a sliding scale that says there are different people. I'm a resident of the lovely city of Grosse Pointe Woods. I'm driving one day on my way to a doctor's appointment that had me kind of scary, one of those women's scary appointments, because I'd heard some news that I didn't like. I'm running late. I stop at the stop sign. I pick up my phone and tell the people I'm running late because I don't want to miss this appointment because I need to find out what's going on. I'm driving down Mac. Suddenly there's a police officer. I see the whirling thingy and I stop. I'm a seriously middle-aged and possibly to many people old Black woman in a BMW. Police officer comes up to me. He says, "You were talking on the phone." I was like, "Well, yeah, at the stop sign, but okay." And I'm fumbling, trying to find my stuff. And you know how we keep our stuff in the purse, otherwise known as the Valley of the Dead. So I'm trying to find the stuff for him. And then I realized that I keep copies of everything on my phone. So I hand him my phone and show him the license and the da. And so he says to me, "Well, you know, I could arrest you." Well, yeah, you could, but exactly why would you? You know? But I'm like, oh, okay. He goes back, he checks whatever you check with whatever computer you check, which tells them, in fact, the car is licensed. It is mine. I do have a driver's license. But before he comes back, suddenly there are two other Grosse Pointe Woods officers standing outside my car. I'm just like, really? For real? Now, when he comes back and says, apparently, when he checked somebody told him I was a judge. That was not my job. That is not who I am. I'm just a licensed driver. And he wants to know I didn't tell him. And I went like, because it wasn't relevant.
Right.
So that's my little old Black lady story in 2019. And I'm positive that Reggie's got stories and that people need to come to understand those stories continue. And it doesn't matter. Our daughters are college graduates. They get followed in stores. I mean, it's a constant state of not normal normalcy. Am I wrong, Reggie?
Oh, you're absolutely right, as always, Your Honor. This is a recurring theme. It will never go away completely. But when people of goodwill work at it, the situation can be improved. I don't mean to sound totally pessimistic when I talk about the fact that this is not going away. What it means is that we all have to be vigilant in order to reduce the negative impacts of racism and to have our communities benefit from diversity and inclusion. When the riot ended, in addition to the Focus Hope experience with Father Cunningham and Eleanor Jositis and the Latanzio family, we also watched the city of Detroit create a Citizens Complaint Bureau in the Detroit Police Department, which had never existed before. I mean, there was an internal affairs department, but the Citizens Complaint Bureau was specifically designed to give people who had been victims of police brutality a place to go that was clearly marked. Citizens Complaint Bureau. The police treat you unfairly if you're beaten, if you're otherwise deprived of rights. There was a place to go in the City of Detroit Police Department. My father was promoted to detective. He was one of the first members of that bureau. And over the course of time, he helped to improve the reputation of the Detroit Police Department, got promoted a few times, ran police departments in a couple of other cities before he passed away. But I will always be proud of the fact that my dad was part of the solution, and that the Detroit Police Department was willing to change in order to address the needs of people of color in Detroit in the 1960s. And today, Judge Stevens mentioned some of my volunteer activities. I'm chair of the Detroit Public Safety Foundation, which supports the police, fire, and emergency medical services of the city of Detroit. And I do that in tribute to my father, because making sure that our first responders have all the tools, all the training that they need, and that they follow the best principles of law enforcement and public safety is something that we can support in the Detroit Public Safety Foundation. So you know, this is not anything that will ever go away completely, but it means people of goodwill have to take affirmative steps in order to reduce the impact of.
So Reggie, when our neighbors see a stop that looks interesting, our European neighbors filming it, just like the person who's in it. Where there is light, there tends to be far fewer rats, you know? So that's kind of, rats don't like light, not at all. So knowing that you're being watched, not just by Black people, but that by anti-racist white people are watching you and checking you, that's helpful. When your kid comes home and tells you that somehow your school system decided it needed to do a reenactment of the Civil War, and it was going to ascribe Confederate roles to people in the class, including those who are Black, that's the time for my European friends to call the school system and go, that's crazy. Yeah. When you walk out of a store and nobody has checked your bag, but somebody checks the bag of the 5 Black people who followed you, you turn around and go, so what's up with that? Those aren't heroic gestures, but they are. They are in the sense that the person who was treated based upon the hierarchy of human value feels valued, right? And that's important. And it's also important because it tells the person who frankly is a working class guy or woman not being paid diddly, but who's acting out of their videotapes and their prejudices, to know that people who look like them think that's crazy.
Right. Also, let's talk a little bit about, continuing from you, Judge, the stance on the statues coming down. People of color have been fighting for this for a while. And I know in Detroit, the mayor allowed for a statue to come down. Is this the right move? What do you have to say on it? Either of you can take that.
Well, I'm a graduate of Cass Technical High School.
As are we both.
And our alumni group is actually having a conversation about
Absolutely.
right now as we speak as to whether the name of that school should be changed. Because Lewis Cass was a racist. And we didn't learn
It's
that.
really tough, isn't it? Because I mean, it's
which will take us right next door to Henry Ford.
Exactly. Right.
So
do you change everything, rip everything down, start from scratch? What do you do?
You know what? There are some false equivalencies where people say, well, if you start with this, then it'll never end. And it might not. And I'm okay with that. Because just as Reggie said, racism, classism, casteism has been with us as humans. And the struggle to eradicate it, to minimize it, to marginalize it is going to end when the world ends. So, you know, when I talk to my European descendant friends, I say, you know what? You don't have time to have diversity fatigue. I've been here 68 years. So it's your turn. Yes, it's going to constantly be a conversation. And it ought to be a conversation. And maybe some things you change, maybe some things you don't. But you change the things that are most offensive and troubling. It might be that Lewis Cass stays Lewis Cass, but darn it, that statue with Lincoln, with the kneeling black guy, maybe that one's one we get rid of, okay? And it doesn't mean that those things are removed from human consciousness. They are placed in a historical context. They are in a museum where people can talk about them, as opposed to being symbols of all that is good and true and wonderful in the world. You know, I'm a bit of a semanticist. I acknowledge that. I'm a word nerd. So I have over time banished the word slave from my vocabulary, because a slave is a noun. This was a human being who was enslaved. And so I'm trying to work on those things linguistically. And it's a constant work for me. My new challenge, having nothing to do with this subject, is to incorporate and understand the vocabulary of those persons who are non-binary, sexually non-binary. You know, I grew up with, you know, he and she. Coming to understand that is helpful to me in my conversation, frankly, with white people about Black people. And I like this whole thing of people of color, and there are lots of, there are all sorts of colors. I am a kind of specific person of color. I'm a Black person, although my 23andMe thing scared the heck out of me. But I'm a person who is phenotypically a Black person, okay? So my principal responsibility is to that group of human beings. That's my mission. That's what I do. I care about other human beings. I am responsible for being respectful to them, listening to them, engaging intellectually and spiritually with them. But I have to take care of my own house first. And I think that European descendant persons of goodwill, taking care of their own house, taking care of their house so their house doesn't offend them. So they don't turn red when someone said, Uncle Joe has always been Uncle Joe, but Uncle Joe doesn't have to say everything he thinks. And he doesn't have to say it in front of Biddy Bear, who's 3 years old. And he doesn't get to repeat that to your grandchildren. And so he can be at family dinner and you just cut off his Jack Daniels early and make sure the children are awake so you can protect them. That's a part of being an anti-racist, to protect the next generation from the worst of us. I have within my family a group of human beings who have not accepted the fact that not all guys want to date girls and not all girls want to date guys. And some people don't want to date anybody. And I am apparently the Thanksgiving Day police. Reggie, I'm the Thanksgiving Day police. And I remind a couple special people in my family who, if they're listening, they know who they are, that the F word does not come in my house. And that when it comes, you get sent not to the children's table, but the basement. And you can sit there with the other 92-year-old men and talk to yourselves until the cows come home. And I'm gonna love you, but I'm not going to let you tell my Jamara and my BJ. You're not gonna teach them that. It ain't happening.
So it's all about
You'll
being
get to be a
soft.
grandparent soon, Reggie. It's coming.
I'm
So with
looking
that, we're
for.
talking about our next generation, we're talking about our current generation. Are things improving in terms of racism? We look back at the 60s, and then many of our non-Black people are saying, you know, things are so much better. There are just a few things that are being singled out. Are things improving in race relations?
You know, I think that, again, the corporate sector has embraced diversity in many ways. Obviously, they're not always perfect either, and there are incidents of racism that still occur in the corporate community. But I think the best corporations, and in fact those that research shows have the best results, tend to have the best diversity. It will be important for us to continue to work on this. And as I said, this is not a problem that will end. This is not a problem that will be completely resolved. It will always take affirmative action by people of goodwill to ensure that there is diversity and inclusion. But it benefits everybody. You know, as Sandra Day O'Connor said in the Gratz case, the benefits of diversity are not theoretical; they are real. There is empirical evidence that demonstrates that diversity produces better results, and so just out of understanding of the benefits of diversity, we should all be seeking to improve diversity and inclusion of our lives, recognizing that that's not going to happen for many people. Some people who still want to have that power over others and just won't give it up.
I have a question coming in. It's for both of you. What advice would you give to boards that are trying to celebrate and embrace equitable opportunities and denounce racism as they serve their communities? Judge Stevens?
Well, let's start out with look at yourself. My mother, the original Diane, had an interesting phrase, so I hope you're not all offended by this. But she said, everybody ought to look at themselves with their hair uncombed, their teeth unbrushed, naked in the mirror every now and again. Because you're going to see some stuff. Right. And so I suggest that every board needs to do a real 360 and make sure that it knows who it is and where those extra rolls of fat are. And if you do that examination and it's as consistent, as consistent as your strategic plan, as consistent as your 5-year audit for your accounting, then that's the first thing. You've demonstrated a consistent review. And a consistent review and an institutional commitment is far more important than a periodic statement or, you know. Now, sometimes you're FedEx and you get the chance to say that Washington team's name has to change. So sometimes you're going to get a dramatic opportunity. But for most of us, our lives are filled with little drama, except when our 2-year-olds go crazy. So it's a game of inches. It's not a game of yards.
Mr. Turner?
Well, I want to thank you, Gail, for giving the opportunity to giving me the opportunity to participate in this program this evening. I am hopeful that those who are viewing this program will consider what each of us can do to improve our current circumstances. I think pretty much everybody has seen at least some flash of the video of the killing of George Floyd. I can't imagine that anyone would be comfortable having seen that video of a sworn police officer on a public street with his knee on the neck of a handcuffed person laying on the ground for 8 minutes while the person is saying he cannot breathe. You break it down into that it makes it very, very clear that this is a problem that will never end, but we must be vigilant in ensuring that we provide training, that we educate both the police and the public, and that we take action to punish those who would seek to deprive others of their constitutional rights, their liberty, and in the case of George Floyd, life.
And since you mentioned George Floyd, and sometimes I caution mentioning this, it could be just my thought, and I try not to impose my thoughts, but George Floyd, terrible, terrible situation that occurred there. However, we see this time and time again to that severity. I mean, from hanging on up to the current. What made this situation draw the most attention among non-Blacks?
You know what? I'm a person of faith. I don't know how sometimes God steps in and says to us, I know I gave you free will, but you're acting a fool. But this is one of those circumstances. There was a confluence of forces. We were all at home from COVID. This was a moment where nobody was worrying about trying to make partner or whatever. The nation was still. And in this stillness, we were given, say, man's inhumanity, the hierarchy of human value. It happened. In the 60s, things happened. Spontaneous things happened. The letter from the Birmingham jail happened. The Pettus Bridge happened. I am so grateful that there is a generation of young persons who remind me of, I was part of shutting down the University of Michigan for a few days for its racist policies. It was led by people, by Black people. It was supported by conscious, woke, white people, and it worked. And I can't tell you why that happened that time in 71 when it didn't happen in 69. But I am delighted to see that same confluence of forces between a new generation of humans who are just like sick and tired of it. We don't have just Fannie Lou Hamer who's sick and tired. We got Moisey who's sick and tired. We have Muhammad who's sick and tired. We got Betty Jo. We got Peggy. We got the Bradshaw III, who are just like appalled. And so whatever it is that made this work, the only question is how we of an older generation support them, reinforce them, and then remind them that when it was asked of Micah, what is asked of you, old man, to do justice. They're doing something. I'm with that.
Sounds great. We're winding down our program at this time, but I'd like to give both of you some Less closing statements. Sounds like I'm in court, huh? Closing arguments or closing statements. Mr. Turner, let's start with you, please. 30 seconds.
Thank you. I want to thank the Novi Public Library for bringing us together this evening, and thank Gail for your coordinating this program. I hope that those who have viewed it have enjoyed the comments. It's always my privilege to work with Judge Cynthia Stevens. We've done a fair amount of bar work and community work together over the course of time, and she's always a thoughtful and brilliant conversationalist, and she's one of the best judges we have on the bench in the state of Michigan. So it's a privilege to be a part of this. And I want to thank all of you for listening to us, those who are out there. And I hope you'll consider how you can contribute to the improvement of the quality of life in our community, in our state, in our nation. We all have that responsibility, no matter what our racial or religious or national origin may be. We're all in this together, and we all have a reason to support diversity and inclusion and fair practices for all.
Thank you. Judge Stevens?
Well, you know, I want to thank the people who've joined us and the library for affording us the opportunity to have this kind of conversation.
There you are.
This is a moment, and I hope we all take advantage of this exceptional moment. Take advantage of it to spend time with our families, to really talk about how we feel about the world we live in, to arm ourselves with the tools that will allow us to let the people we love be better people. I don't know if you all are gonna have to put your cousins in the basement too, sometimes, but get the energy to do that, to do it with love, with respect and affection, and with the belief that the arc of the universe does lean toward justice. The lean just isn't fast enough yet. So thank you.
Judge Stevens and Mr. Turner, it was my honor and pleasure to have both of you as my guests today. I encourage everyone to log back on this Thursday. We will have a panel of teenagers and young adults, diverse group that will share their thoughts and experiences on racism. So I hope you will log in this Thursday at the Novi Public Library's Facebook page or Zoom account at 6:30 p.m. And I hope to see you then. Thank you both very much this evening. Have a good one.
Good night.
Good night.